The bit I don't think we've figured out is in the services-oriented industry. Good evening and welcome to the third interview in ACS's Industry Insights Leaders Series, featuring Australian tech leaders from a range of industry sectors who will share their expertise on how technology and innovation transforms and shapes the Australian economy. My name is Andrew Johnson, Chief Executive Officer of the ACS, and I will be your host for this evening. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Tonight our guest is Matthew Pancino, former CTO at the Commonwealth Bank. In his career, Matt has held senior operational and technology executive roles at CBA, Suncorp, Perpetual, Telstra and Ticketek. He's currently in transition period before he starts a new role as Director of Industry Solutions Asia Pacific at Google. This evening we'll be taking questions from our audience direct. Please use the chat function in YouTube, and at the end of our conversation, we'll be able to take questions from you, our ACS members. Welcome, Matt.
Oh, hi, it's great to be here.
Going on to the questions.
Okay.
First one. Matt, would like to take you back 6 years when you were showcased in ACS's Executive's Guide to Navigating Digital Disruption. You were at Suncorp at the time, and we got your views on how Australia's digital economy was changing. At that time, you said there was a commitment to turn vast data sets into actionable insights. What does that look like, and how has that changed in the banking and finance sector over the last 6 years?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. Also, I need to be more selective in where I come because 6 years is a long time, and now you're dredging up predictions from 6 years ago, so I'll try and do my best. But look, in answer to your question, I think when it comes to thinking about the great acquisition of data and the importance of data to any organisation, I think the goal still fundamentally is there, and I think organisations' maturity of understanding of their importance of data has really improved in the last couple of years. I think some of the lessons perhaps that where we were in 6 years ago, which is an eternity ago, is back then it was really around how do we get as much unstructured data, because there was this technology that was available that for the first time was enabled us to easily unlock data so quickly. But some of the lessons we've learned over the period of time is, just being able to acquire data without having a good understanding of its provenance, of how it came about, how it was entered, its data quality, actually meant that we can, in some cases, created a lot of complexity. And I think when you kind of reflect, particularly in the financial services industry over the last few years, and it's been quite difficult, certainly from kind of 2017 to 2019, through the period of the Royal Commission. Yes, the industry let a lot of people down, and the Royal Commission went through a vast array of reasons why that's the case. Leadership, governance, incentives, a whole range of things. But the thing as a technologist that really struck me about the Royal Commission was its focus on poor quality of data. And I think that's where a lot of the kind of root cause issues of some of the challenges we had with customers came through poor quality data, old legacy systems not having good data strategies to be able to manage that data effectively. So I think 6 years on, it's more about, it's less about just data acquisition, and it's more about having a holistic data strategy. So what that really means is, how do you actually acquire the data in the first place? How do you keep that data? How do you secure that data? How do you make it safe? How do you use it in the appropriate way and at the appropriate time, being able to destroy that data appropriately? In the last 6 years, the kind of benchmark and expectation of how we use data has materially changed. I think it was 2016, GDPR was introduced, the European data privacy legislation. It didn't exist 6 years ago. It's well known that the Australian Privacy Commission is strengthening Australian privacy laws. And even in places like the United States, there is, I think it was in January, they introduced the California Consumer Protection Act. So the bar in terms of how we use data and how we keep data continues to rise. Its importance to an organisation is still there, but when you get those things right, you can do really, really amazing things with data. Possibly the best example of that actually is from my former employer, the Commonwealth Bank, and that is, again, what wasn't available to us 6 years ago was the at-scale machine learning tools. So one of the most impressive pieces of technology I've seen in a very, very long time is something called the Customer Engagement Engine at the Commonwealth Bank. It's able to process millions, if not billions, of data points from across its 10 million customer base, and using about 200 machine learning models can actually deliver next best conversations to customers and help them in their everyday finances, whether by logging onto the app, ringing the call centre, actually getting cash from the ATM. You'll see little messages actually popping up on the systems, and so this system's been used to help people in bushfires. It's been helping farmers in the drought appeal, all kinds of range of uses where you're using machine learning at scale on data sets to help customers. And I think that's what's changed, because I think actionable insights is ultimately where you want to get to. So long answer, lots changed. It's probably less around data acquisition and now more around a holistic data strategy and then using it for actionable insights using machine learning technologies.
Thank you. We might just use that as a good test. So the banking and finance sector in Australia is really mature and in many respects a world leader. But if we would go back to your time at Suncorp in 2014, you're consolidating 800 data analysts from across the business into a centralised service and reducing data warehouses down from 12 to 1. For our members who might be in the industries that aren't quite as mature, let's just take us on that journey. What were your key learnings from that centralisation and the maturity of how to use data for informing business decisions? That machine learning sounds great, not available to everyone at this point in time, but we all do need to get there. So what did you learn over that period?
Well, again, I think it comes back to, I probably learned from the mistakes we made. I mean, if you're going to lift and shift complexity of old legacy systems data into a data warehouse, you're really just shifting the problem regarding data quality into another area. And that's a really, really big challenge. In fact, one of the things, I was in the United States late last year, and they went through this in the global finance, like the big investment banks in the United States went through this in the GFC, where many of them went to the wall. And the regulators really clamped down on them regarding how do you make sure you understand the quality of your data. Again, how do you acquire that data? What happens to it, okay, when it goes into the source systems in between the time it's in the source systems to the actual warehouses? How do you know the lineage or the provenance of that data, and how do you know it's being used in the most appropriate way? This requires a total holistic data strategy that is actually broader than just your data warehousing or your cloud-based or your big warehouse play, whatever that may be. So I guess the biggest learning is data is kind of like, it is the foundation of every organisation. If not, I had a board member once call it the original sin, how you manage your data. But I think it's broader than just the data sciences portfolio. It's actually something for all of technology and all of IT to consider when they think about using data effectively for an organisation.
Again, back in 2014, you said that Suncorp needed to be very aware of what disruptive technologies might mean for the organisation, and keeping an eye on the impact of safer and smarter cars on the general insurance and the impact of disruptive payment startups on the banking business. What was the effect of augmenting the most basic human senses using wearables at that time, and what does that look like? And it's really beneficial to look back 6 years. What has surprised you about the emerging tech landscape? What didn't you see coming more so than what did you see coming?
Yeah, again, the perils of showing up 6 years later. I'll answer that in two parts. If you were to ask me this question in December about what's fundamentally changed about disruption, I probably would have said not as much as I would have liked. If you think about it, there's been a lot of talk about fintech disruption even 6 years ago. And even at December, through everything that the industry went through, there were still very large dominant banks in the industry. In fact, very strong, not a lot had changed. With the possible exception, so I think the change that occurred was actually more evolutionary change, whether it be contactless payments and et cetera. And in actual fact, probably the big surprise through that period was one of the fintechs that did break through that I think caught everyone's eye, and I'm not here to discuss the merits of the particular business model, was really Afterpay. Afterpay saw a particular market, saw an opportunity, and really grew in a very small market in Australia at a very quick pace, which I think surprised everybody. And I think as a result of that, I think what you're seeing particularly in the banking industry now, is recognition from the traditional players that rather than try and fear disruption, how do you embrace and collaborate with disruptors to be able to further your business needs? And whether it be every one of the big banks now has some form of innovation venture to work collaboratively with startups and the startup environment and fintechs. I know DBS in Singapore, I think may have been last week, that they've just announced that they're going to build an ecosystem play for fintechs to work on their platform. I think it was Standard Chartered in Singapore, I think so. And I think with the Australian government legislation around open banking, it's trying to create a richer ecosystem for fintechs to collaborate better with the major players.
One of our previous guests in the series was non-executive director Sam Mostyn. And Sam was dismissing the notion that we're going to go back to business as usual post-COVID-19. What does the future look like for an Australian business as we emerge from this crisis?
Yeah, first of all, I've got to say I feel a bit uncomfortable talking about the post-COVID crisis, because I think it's all pretty new and we don't exactly know where it's going to go. And I think the second point is, I'd say it's phenomenal, I think, and I don't want to sound political or anything. I think generally the people who have been in charge of this country broadly across all political domains and set forth have done an exceptional job managing us through this crisis. So they may be better qualified to be able to answer that particular question. But I think, stating the obvious, there will be a lot of positives. I'm sure we'll talk about innovation in this COVID-19 time. But I think first and foremost, I think we have to accept that it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult for businesses right across the board. We're going into a period of economic downturn, so irrespective of why, that's going to be just hard on everybody. And I think it's really important also when we look forward not to generalise. Because businesses will have very different outcomes depending on what they're actually operating in. The outcomes, if you're in hospitality or tourism, for example, will be vastly different from the outcomes from this fantastic AV setup where we're sitting around and the company who runs this AV setup. But I think in aggregate, it's going to be really, really hard. In preparation for this, though, I was actually reading through some stuff, actually, and there was quite an interesting article, I think it was by McKinsey, actually, who talked about, what do technology teams actually have to do? And it kind of went along the lines of the things that we all have to do is kind of stabilise the current situation. I think people have done that phenomenally well, whether it be strengthening remote working. It's been the first time in a long period of time I've travelled around and I've had my friends saying, oh, I'm at working from home. I can't believe how good my IT team is. They've turned on remote working. It's been fantastic. It hasn't been a glitch. I can't believe it. It's really, really fantastic. And that's been universal across all companies. So I think generally, I think our technology teams have responded well. But at the same time, responding to the short-term kind of focus is around how do you strengthen cybersecurity? How do you really think about, in a time of high, I guess, change and high-tech change, how do you make sure you deal with the cybersecurity threat? Also, patterns and ways of working when you've got vast arrays of people working from home. How do you make sure the processes you have in place are actually going to ensure that your workforce can continue to be productive, continue to get their work done, and so forth? And I think quickly break down the vendor costs. I think that's the short term. The second thing is the organisations are going to have to kind of be very, very ready to address the downturn, and that's going to mean pretty aggressive driving down of costs in the short term and prioritisation of projects. It's not slash and burn because the market will come back, but how organisations look at their vendors, how they look to find the short-term cost reductions in a time of economic downturn is going to be critical. It's not something everybody loves talking about. I mean, as a tech professional, it's the last thing you want to hear, but there is kind of like a reality. It's happened before. This too will pass in time, hopefully quickly. So organisations have to prepare for that. And then last thing is really organisations have to kind of prepare, be digitally ready. First and foremost, if you have a digital channel, it has to sing in times like these. It really, really has to really, really sing. And so, focusing on being safe and secure and stable through this period of time, providing continuity of service is absolutely key. And then I think it really comes down to how do you think about adapting and interacting with customers in very, very new ways. And what are those new ways? Like, is this ACS series, the webinars, a new way of ACS going to be able to interact with its membership base moving forward? Is that going to be something that comes back in the new world? I'm amazed at some of the examples of companies, particularly small businesses, having to adapt in a short period of time in this COVID-19 crisis. Has been quite amazing. I'm sure everybody who is on the webcast has their own experience of dealing with a small business in a new way in such a short period of time.
What about, in terms of the context of only just now our restrictions started to be lifted, and only in a small way, in banking and finance there's been these massive investments in open plans to foster collaboration, activity-based work and the like. How will that need to change as restrictions are lifted, we move into the next sort of 6-month period? And what sort of role can technology play to create safer workspaces?
Wow. This is actually quite a controversial question, I think. For the listeners who don't understand why I say that is, I don't know whether it's because Australians have such a high obsession with real estate. Real estate, and particularly work real estate, is one of those things that everybody believes they're an expert on. So I'm not going to pretend I am. Look, I think, if I reflect on some of the positives first in a very difficult period, the outlook for how teams work together and collaboration from an agile perspective is hopefully really, really bright. And the reason why I say that is the mass adoption of collaboration tools that remote working has forced is quite astounding. My wife is a clinician for the New South Wales Department of Health. Their adoption of remote working and adoption of, collaboration tools which were previously only the domain of tech professionals has been quite astounding. I mean, the teaching profession's ability to move at a phenomenal pace to educate our children remotely deserves just the most highest praise I have seen firsthand with my gardening leave. just how well the schools are being able to adapt to remote learning. And I think, so what happens is, as we come out of this phase, hopefully we won't lose many of those practices. And then you think about what that means as people gradually come back into the office. And of course, you know, it's going to be difficult working out how to navigate lifts and all of these kinds of things. You know, I think ultimately, I'll be a bit controversial, I think hot desking, hopefully, will be dead. Now, having been in the agile world since 2009 or 8, you know, we've always put a premium on teams being able to co-locate to a degree. And there's always been a challenge with hot desking and real estate divisions, because the argument has always been, and it's a valid argument, well, you want to maximise the utilisation of your office space. You know, do you only need 7 desks for 10 people, for example? And if you hot desk, you can optimise the way the spaces are used and the way real estate works. And so that is a valid argument, and it's very hard to measure the benefits of actually having true agile teams co-located, collaborating with a good and healthy culture. So the good news is, out of all of this, hopefully, is now that we've been able to demonstrate that we've been able to work productively, working from home, as we come back into the office, we can still meet the financial metrics that the real estate teams have always yearned for. You'll need less real estate for the number of people you'll have. But hopefully people can return to a particular patod or a particular location to get the benefits of that social collaboration that they're so useful with. And you'll have a COVID-safe environment, and you'll have better adoption of the collaboration tools through the very fact that remote working has been forced upon us in the first place. So I see there's a tremendous opportunity for organisations to be even more productive than they were before, give employees much more flexible working conditions. And I think, you know, I think the penny's dropped. I've read many articles in the paper in the last couple of weeks predicting that maybe companies don't need these massive edifice buildings in CBD locations that people have to commute an hour from the Central Coast to and from. Moving forward, maybe those days are behind us.
What about just in general, more broadly, the maturity of Australia's digital economy? So if we look at the top 20 companies on the ASX, dominated by banking and finance, what would be your tips? You mentioned we're just about to go into this economic downturn, it's very much at the starting line. Your tips for business on how to approach this economic climate and to rely on technology to help with business growth? Yeah,
it's one of those things. I was reading another article talking about, I think the challenge is going to be how do we acquire talent in this market ultimately for those top 20 companies, and how quickly you can adapt to a digital environment. I guess we're lucky in some respects of our geographic location. If you were to take, if you were to graph the percentage of business done on mobile devices as a percentage of their economy globally, of countries by the globe, you'd find the top 10 countries who transact via mobile devices in the world are Asian countries. I think that's broadly because their economies have effectively leapfrogged. They've grown so fast in such a short period of time in the age of the mobile phone. They've leapfrogged many of the legacy technologies and legacy infrastructure that traditional companies have had. And I think there are lessons to be learned by that. And I think for Australian businesses, it's how do we continue to interact with our customers in a new digital way that is going to create a differentiating edge moving forward. Now, again, I don't want to gloss over what is going to be an extraordinarily difficult period for the next few years, but you know, I see great examples of businesses adapting, and they're not top 20 companies of small businesses, but whether it be by the physio I go to, I have to do an old person's back class once a week. I now do that from the comfort of my rumpus room. I know of an Italian restaurant in town who now has selling its cellar online, and it's selling its fresh pasta that it makes and various bits and pieces. Now, none of these particular changes in interactions are going to, really make up for the loss that these businesses are currently going through. However, when things return, being able to augment existing services with new digital capabilities will be a real opportunity that I hope a lot of businesses take forward.
So you mentioned that it was going to be tough recruiting in this current environment. If I was to pick on a few stats, Deloitte Access Economics suggesting that with the handbrake on or having the borders closed, we might be down anything up to 30,000 tech professionals in the May to June period. And the Prime Minister forecasting that permanent migration could drop by as much as 85% in the next 12 months. How do you source technical talent in a tight labour market and in an economic downturn?
Yeah. Okay. So I think in the very, very short term, the problem may get hidden. And it may get hidden by the fact that I know many large organisations, again, as organisations pivot for the downturn that's going to happen. A lot of strategic projects are being put on hold, a lot of, big initiatives, companies are going to be paring back as a function of the economy. And I think, particularly in terms of contractors, perhaps some vendors and suppliers are going to be squeezed. I think there will be talent available in the short term. But the talent we all need to come out of this is going to be, I think, perennially difficult to get moving forward, particularly in light of the statistics that you rightly put forward. I do think, however, this could be one of those seminal moments where, with the right leadership, we could make a long-term difference to the health of the country's workforce. If you were to kind of take a step back and look at one of the industries that's been hit the hardest, it's going to be the higher education system. If you look at who, from an employment point of view, is going to be hit the hardest, it's going to be young people in casual labour work, so forth. And I think, how do we, as a country and an organisation, incent, tool our future generations of kids, or the kids we want to work over the next few generations? How do we tool them with the jobs that are going to be there? And particularly in this future of a digital economy, I think there's a great opportunity for us, to actually, provided we can incent the kids into the right area, actually bring people through into areas where they will have the skills, where the jobs will be. A computer science professional or an IT professional is going to have a vastly different outlook at the moment than a hospitality graduate. So how do we, and hopefully that's only an imbalance for a short time with the hospitality, but how do we actually kind of address this structurally with our young from an education point of view will be a key thing moving forward. I think, ACS will have a role in being able to push that agenda.
Thank you. We'll make sure we tweet that one.
Yeah.
Business continuity has been front of mind, and we did advertise this session as being about cloud. COVID-19 has brought home that many organisations didn't have the fail-safes in place that they might have liked. Can you walk us through a journey for an organisation taking that journey to moving all servers off-prem and going to the cloud?
Yeah. Again, I mean, let's think about the journeys of the past. I think in the last, take a step back. I kind of view cloud as kind of like a game of 4 quarters. Maybe it's a basketball game of 4 quarters. And I think we're about at the halfway mark. I think if you think of kind of the rise of prominence of cloud was kind of 2009, 2010, really showing my age now for all the younger people out there. The first quarter was characterised by, this was a startups only thing. only the startups used cloud. They were the cool kids on the block. And then very early in that first quarter, some organisations recognised the trend to being able to get basically, the way I describe it is cloud to me is the automation of the infrastructure layer. Saw the benefits of being able to, for developers and operations and cost and resilience, and went all in early hard. I think the second quarter was characterised by cloud becoming kind of mainstream. We saw the birth of a lot of private clouds, hybrid clouds, now SaaS providers rising. And, I think there were a lot of lessons that learned because a lot of people rushed into the cloud, and kind of like data actually, kind of just moved a lot of their compute into the cloud thinking it'd save money and thinking it'd solve all of their problems. And lo and behold, they picked up a whole lot of complexity in their old legacy data center environments, and they kind of just shifted it to the cloud, and they kept their old data centers because there was certain regulations that said they couldn't, or alleged regulations that said they couldn't, yada, yada, yada. And they actually increased the complexity in our IT environment, which slowed their velocity down, set their costs up, and it's kind of like, well, this is not great. I think as we go into kind of the third quarter, it's really, really interesting. I think cloud comes with a holistic IT strategy. It has to come with the whole IT strategy. It can't be just a thing into itself. I mean, I was in the Bay Area last year, as I mentioned earlier, and you can't buy software anymore. You can only get SaaS, right? So you can only get cloud-based software. So really, when you think about IT strategy, it's use SaaS where you can for commodity non-differentiating capabilities. For your differentiating core capabilities, how do you think about consolidating duplicate functions, decommissioning legacy or unused systems, and then modernizing your core for the digital capabilities? And if you do all of those things and you use cloud as the underlying vehicle to be able to get simplifications of the way you deliver value into production and actually, for your workloads, then you will be successful. I think we're at the start of a really interesting period. I still think there's a lot of data centers there that probably don't need to be there. It's going to be an interesting second half of cloud.
So from your experience then, for businesses with a large disparate range of systems, what are the key approaches to developing that data strategy, and also in today's customer-focused personalisation type world, an identity strategy?
Yeah. I think the way you've got to take a look at it is, how do you eat the elephant? And that would be, just one bite at a time. It's a horrible cliche, but it's a true cliche in the sense that there is no magic bullet to being able to rid an organisation of complexity. Much of that complexity is tied up with legacy processes, legacy manual processes, legacy products. And the cost of change is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to get a business case to stack up to actually make that change. However, the way to take an approach to it is to have very clear roadmaps of where you're going to go. I think Wayne Gretzky said you've got to play to where the puck is going, not where the puck is. And so those roadmaps have to be very clear that the question is, as you spend your money, as you go through your IT budget, do you spend it in a way that's going to just keep the complexity in your IT environment the same? Or do you leave it a little bit better every time you spend $1? Right? And it's that little bits and pieces of improvements over a period of time that will give you velocity, resiliency, and the things that you need. So, and your operating leverage and your cost. So I think my best advice was, you need a 3-year approach to how you're going to do this. There are no Hail Marys, but a good executed IT strategy will ultimately get you there.
What about what technologies and capabilities have you most excited about the future?
Well, I won't cover off the things I'm fiddling with at home because that's a bit silly, some of the programming stuff I'm doing at the moment, but that's... I think the thing that excites me at the moment is actually the opportunity that cloud brings. Even with cloud, the degrees of freedom in which you can deliver value, like a development team or a technology team can deliver value to customers, is so great, it is just too easy to create complexity. Building CI/CD tool chains, building developer environments where you actually go from idea to production, there's still too much variability, which, it's great, you give all this empowered freedom, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of complexity in being able to develop value quickly. So it's very hard to justify to the business why this is a good idea. I think a lot of the technologies that really excite me is make the things that make it really, really easy for developers to be, and the entire people involved in the SDLC to be highly productive. The things I always used to say to my team is, I want our development framework to be so easy that our graduates can ship code on their first day in the job and they fall into the pit of success. And what I mean by that is they won't know it, but they'll be writing code that will be CS234 compliant. It'll conform to the Australian privacy standards, all the kind of things that make developers go, really? It'll be cyber secure, it'll be safe, all of those types of things, but will really empower people and teams to deliver high value to customers quickly and safely. Those technologies which are being unlocked in a cloud-based world, those are the things that really excite me at the moment. It's actually one of the reasons why I've kind of jumped to Google.
Excellent. What about for that bell curve of businesses that are very simple transaction processes in place? We think of COVID-19. How do you go about applying a range of contactless payment systems? What would be your tips?
Oh, well, I think the answer is just do it, actually, probably, because if you look, and I can't remember the statistic, I saw the head of the retail bank of Combank Combank released some MasterCard figures a couple of weeks ago. In fact, they're available to all the banks. The rise in contactless payments as a result of COVID is up 25+%, right? The adoption of Apple Pay pre-COVID-19, you'd argue, was almost a bit anemic, and now it's just gone, and it's going to be there to play. So I think the opportunity for businesses is really ask your bank what's available in the merchant, particularly in the merchant space, what's available in the acquiring space, because I think there are a lot of interesting technologies that are coming down the track for businesses to be able to do acquisition really, really easily. But I think contactless is going to be here to stay. So I would move there as fast as you can.
And as people are moving rapidly towards more digital solutions, what about the cybersecurity landscape? What are the best practice approaches to enhancing your governance and your cybersecurity posture?
I think in the current environment, the human firewall's the weakest link. There is just so much change. People are now working from home. People are they'll have probably their personal emails on one side, their work emails close to them as well. I think, cyber education of all employees is going to be key through this period of time. How do you make every one of your employees a cyber person? How do you make every one of your developers care about cybersecurity? So how do you double down on your phishing campaigns? How do you double down on education with your users? How do you double down on educating people to make sure they keep their data safe? How do you double down on making sure people lock their computers when they're not at home? These are all things I think it is around during these periods. If you thought you had an obligation to educate your workforce around cyber threats before, it's probably even greater right now. So I think in the short term, my advice would be really enlist your employees to be your first line of defense in the cyber war.
And that's excellent. Just to take that a little bit more pragmatically, how do you embed this culture and do more phishing tests and the like when you've got all your staff working from home in an environment where productivity might not be quite at the level it once was while we bed down these new practices? How do you make that balance between investing in cyber awareness, cyber posture, but also keeping an eye on the key business drivers in an environment where the economy is going backwards?
Yeah, you know, I think it's one of those things. Cyber is the one exception. Remember I said, if we're going to go into an economic downturn, I mentioned a lot of the banks will be pulling back on their big strategic projects, at least in the very short term, to reprioritise onto more digital assets. I think cyber is one of those areas where you're going to be permanently investing substantial amounts of money into making your organisation safe. So, unfortunately, I think, not unfortunately, I think it's just an important thing of, if you're going to become a more digital business, then you are going to need more digital protection. Therefore, you must invest more to protect the digital assets of your organisation. So I think, unfortunately, the advice for every company I would give is invest there first.
Final question before I throw to our viewers. One of the standout comments you made in our Executive's Guide to Digital Disruption.
Making that haunt me, aren't you?
Oh, I am, but this is save the best one to last. You mentioned the need to focus on T-shaped skills.
Yeah.
What does that look like in today's world?
I still believe that, by the way. There's a couple of tenets, and how do we bring people through the organisation to make sure we do that? What I think about T-shaped skills is, imagine the horizontal bar of the T. This is for tech professionals. Is the entire system development lifecycle. So whether it's ideation, whether it's UX, whether it's business analysis, to then programming, to being a software test engineer, to being an operations support staff, to be on call, whatever the case may be. Think of that's an entire chain of capabilities that actually go involved in delivering value to customers. While it's really important to have depth in a particular expertise, I do believe it is important to be deep. If you're going to be a business analyst or a programmer or a software testing engineer, be a good one. Be deep in your subject matter expertise. But do it in a way where you understand the context and the different roles people play across that T-shape. So if you understand the mechanics of what it takes, right? If you're at this end of the SDLC of what's required at this end of the SLC, you'll be able to help people in different parts of the organisation make better decisions that will ultimately make your depth of experience, it will actually help you in your role moving forward. So that's the way I view T-shaped expertise. Everyone will have a different discipline, but you've got to understand the entire ecosystem to actually make a highly successful collaborative team.
Thank you. First question from our audience comes from Cameron Leach. Is there commonly significant data conversion between source system and warehouse because it's twice the storage?
So what was that, sorry? Is there
Commonly significant data conversion between source system and warehouse because it's twice the storage?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The answer is you will get twice the storage generally. But if you do it right, the cost of that storage and the cost of that warehouse should be more than manageable. Yeah.
David Kong, given the potential advantages of cloud, how can a company ensure that data processed, collected and stored with a cloud provider remains in Australia?
Oh, that nut's been cracked. Definitely. And in fact, it's a regulatory requirement that's actually an APRA requirement. That's the case. That's why both Amazon, Microsoft and Google have availability zones in Australia. So the data is domiciled here. In fact, many of those organisations have multi-region, so in Australia as well. So you can actually manage what availability zones you choose for your data, and you can also manage what region you choose to operate out of. So that's something that's actually a regulatory requirement that the cloud providers have to do.
From Lee Pearson, how has cloud enabled more innovation within the banking and finance sector?
I think it enables more innovation. It's two way. I think it's from an innovation perspective, it's about time to value or speed, right? The ability to experiment quickly, build a prototype, be able to build a quick app, be able to stand up the infrastructure you need, use the tools, use the inbuilt developer tools, use the monitoring tools that cloud give you, let you prototype at speed because you're effectively buying those capabilities in the can, right? Or out of the can, I should say. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage of being able to use cloud from an innovation perspective.
Next one from Brown Zoo. What is the best way to balance the high data safety solution of private cloud like Amazon Virtual Private Cloud and the high flexible solution of public cloud?
So VPC, Virtual Private Cloud, just is actually public cloud. Okay, it's effectively a virtual version of what is effectively public cloud infrastructure. When it comes to private cloud, I think that's a debate that's been often raged amongst particularly the infrastructure professionals. And I think it's one of those things that the base assumption that you're making that is your data center that you currently have is engineered in a safe and particular way. I think that's the real challenge, and I think sometimes that's a false assumption. You have equal dangers whether you operate in your own data center or you operate in cloud. You have to assume neither is safe, and you have to engineer your systems in a way in which you can protect your data, whether it be on-prem or off-prem. I don't personally differentiate the two. I don't prescribe to the theory that because I have a diesel generator and a rack of storage, that's somehow safer, that's connected to the entire outside world, that's somehow safer than organisations who are committing billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to providing these services, where if they have a security breach, it's the end of their business.
From Devindra, the human firewall is only the start is one that we've heard the most about. What about malicious denial of service with all push to SaaS?
With the push to SaaS. Yeah, I think that is a challenge. Again, it depends on, I think it's important you do the due diligence on your SaaS providers. Again, interestingly enough, SaaS providers these days are actually back-ended mostly onto the public cloud providers, all the big ones. So they too have multi-availability zones, multi-region capability to be able to deploy services as well, and then you can use various denial of service attack tools to actually manage when you have those attacks occur. That's the good ones. So I think it's about having due diligence of your SaaS providers to make sure that they have the appropriate infrastructure. I mean, everyone's dealt with these types of issues before. They're not new. I'm sure there'll be a few new ones we meet in time. But it's about doing your due diligence to make sure your SaaS providers are operating at the same level of you'd expect of your own IT environment.
From Tao, are people moving towards a more distributed data model? And how do you see the future of that in financial industries?
I think the answer to that is yes, without question. You could call the ultimate distributed data model probably blockchain. And I think there's some really, really interesting use cases of blockchain being occurred. The notion of being able to have a record of data that you can know be true, that is a distributed record, is something that is probably a subject we could do another hour on. So I think yes, and I think there are many examples of experimentations in blockchain at the moment which are showing a lot of promise. I personally think 10 years down the track it'll be the end of databases as we know it, but anyway.
From Siddharth, how do you balance innovation versus being relevant? We might just also add, in an economic downturn where the bigger projects and every project's being reprioritised, how do you balance the innovation investment?
Versus being...
relevant was Siddharth's, but just also in the
Yeah.
context of economic downturn.
Look, I think I mentioned it before. Context has changed. So when I talk about companies pulling back on their big strategic projects, context has changed. What's interesting is businesses that will really thrive are the ones that are going to be able to find new ways of interacting with their customers in a COVID environment. That's innovation, right? So I think the balance, I mean, the level of innovation, whether it'll be the little Italian restaurant I talked about or the physio place or ACS finding a new way of interacting with its members, those are investments that are going to pay off in the long term. So I think, interestingly enough, we've probably, and I haven't even covered what I think of telehealth, right? The phenomenal productivity benefits we're going to see in telehealth. So I think it's one of those weird situations where, well, it's kind of like in crisis times, you actually see the best innovations occur and the best opportunity for innovation. So the two aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, you could almost argue the opposite. Times of crisis drive innovation. So we just have to be open to that.
A question from a small business perspective with low budget. How do you recommend they navigate infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service? How do they start on their digitisation journey?
I think it depends on what your business is. So what I would do is I would start with the SaaS-based offerings. I mean, look at companies like Xero. People used to run their own accounting software. I know you're going to have Steve on in a couple of weeks, right? Xero is a software as a service model for a relatively small business. So I think you start with the non-differentiating IT and you look for SaaS models that are going to be compelling for you. The notion that you would need to own your own infrastructure as a small business when it comes to technology, I think, is something that, 10 years ago you didn't have a choice, but you used to buy, I think you used to have to buy, and you had to buy a cardboard box with MYOB or something in it. You had to buy a cardboard box, buy a PC, stick it in and hope for the best. It's gone. Right? All you need is a reliable internet connection and off you go. So I think these technologies as a small business, whether you want to host a web capability, use Canva to get your graphics done, the opportunities for small businesses to survive and thrive in these types of environments, or with the technology that they could use, I should say, the options are endless.
Jay Deep, your advice for a 22-year-old just starting their career as a technology consultant at a Big Four who aspires to be a successful senior executive in technology?
22. Don't rush. There's plenty of time. I think consulting is an excellent way to start because you're going to get broad exposure to lots of different companies and lots of different industries and lots of different problem spaces. So I think that's something you've got to do. In fact, I spent some time consulting in the late 90s, and it was the thing that made me actually decide I wanted to become a CIO. I didn't really know what they did, but I knew they made decisions. And I thought, oh, that's something I'd like to do. And so that's where I began my career. And my advice to a 22-year-old would be never, ever as soon as you worry about the title of your next role, it's over. It really is. Don't think, always, whenever you're going into a role, don't think about the role you're going into, think about the skills and capabilities it will give you that would open doors for the next role. And then when you go into that next role, because a door opens, you need timing, a bit of luck, and you need skills. Go into that role thinking about what are the skills and capabilities I can learn that would give me the opportunity for the next role. And so it's around acquiring skills, acquiring arrows for your quiver, being curious and wanting to learn, wanting to understand what the skills you don't have, and then let the rest take care of itself. Like I said, I see this time and time again. As soon as people come to me and say, I really want to get promoted, I really want to do this, and I say, okay, what do you want to do? And they say, I want to be a general manager. And I go, general manager of what? Is that it? They just want the title and position. I think that's, for me personally, when I say that, I think that's an either. You just got to keep learning. And it never stops, even for old guys like us.
One source of pride for Australia through COVID, having seen so many supply chains fall over, is the fact that our agriculture provides enough food to sustain the country. This one from Anne, do you think using private cloud space is a solution in solving farm data security issues in Australia? How much safer is it, and why should farmers believe in technology and public-private partnerships?
So I don't believe public cloud is any less safe than private cloud. I think the key to how you secure it is going to be how you use the technology and how you engineer the technology. I think that's a difficult question. So it depends for agricultural farmers, and it depends what solutions that they're using, how they're hosted, how they're engineered, who they're hosting them with, and what they're doing will be the keys to trust. But I couldn't answer the question more than that.
How about one final question before we finish? Where do you see Australia's strengths in certain industries? Where do we have the most upside coming out of COVID-19 if we get the digitisation aspect right?
That's a really broad question. So let me, rather than say what I think Australia could be good at, because clearly, agriculture and tourism and hospitality, they will all come back in due course. It will take a long time, but Australia has just so much to offer. We have great natural resources. We have great agricultural products. It's the best place in the world to live. That's why we're all here. But if I look at where the innovations are really kind of interesting to me are the ones that I think are really highly productive. I think the remote working thing, advances in telehealth. For a country that is just got so few people in it, that is so spread out, what we've learned through COVID-19 is the Medicare shift in 1 week to let doctors be able to bulk bill via telehealth. That's tremendous productivity improvements. I mentioned my wife, she's a clinician. She has to see clients regularly, or patients regularly, and for certain types of patients, they do it via telehealth, which they never would have dreamed of doing it 3 months ago. It's good for the patients, it's good for them, productivity goes through the roof. I think higher education and schools and the way distance learning and all of these types of things. I think there are tremendous opportunities that when the good times return, if we can keep some of the practices, we will be an even more productive country than we've been in the past. That said, it's going to be a tough couple of years.
Matt Pancino, thank you so much for joining us tonight to share your insights across a broad range. And thank you too for our ACS members for all your questions that have been sent through. Looking forward to having you join us next week. We have 2 live streams next week. Firstly, on Monday evening, we've got very lucky to have the Communications Minister, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, joining us, where you can ask all your questions around things like telehealth and how the NBN's been coping with all the digitisation and moving to work from home. And then join us again next Thursday night. Thanks, everyone.